Good morning, Hill Country Bible Church. My name is Tim. I'm one of the pastors here. We are thrilled that you've joined us this darn right chilly Texas morning. Guys, it has dipped into the 70s. I hope that we've all got chili going and your Ugg boots are out for afterwards. This is thrilling to me. We've endured the 7 months of the Texas summer and we are now rewarded until I learned that there's either freak ice storm or the great pollinating. But for now, I'm just believing the Lord for a beautiful fall and winter. For those of you who are not, up to speed with where we've been going as a church, we've been in the Sermon on the Mount looking at Jesus talking to a culture that had kind of drifted from what God had intended for them, and then they had invented a bunch of different half measures to try and elevate themselves back to the place where they thought that they belonged. And it is really, really amazing to me how you can read the words of Jesus speaking to first century Jews under Roman occupation and see how prescient and wise those words are for those of us living around the world 2,000 years later, and how prescient they are to us today. They are remarkably targeted for some of the deep needs in our own culture as we struggle to argue back and forth about what we really need to do to fix things is just X, Y, or Z. And we just keep trying to bolt things on to an already broken system. And Jesus says this: unless your righteousness exceeds the best of your day and age, you're not reflecting the kingdom of heaven. You just represent a little bit best of the worst of your culture. And so we're going to push into a passage today that is actually not difficult to understand. It's difficult to obey. The difficulty will not be here today. It will be here. Now, before we begin, last week we talked through an almost distant concept of taking oaths to heaven, oaths to Jerusalem. And that concept was kind of weird. And I learned that the language I use to describe it in student terminology is way out of date, I did not jump all of us ahead in the future. I actually pulled you into the past. The language I used of cap and no cap is actually like 6 months old, guys, so it is dead. It is dead. So I apologize to all students in the room. That was so cringe. Okay. Here's our passage for the day, though. Verse 38 in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says this: "You have heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." This is very straightforward today. And unfortunately, it's straightforward in a way that is challenging to obey. Let me explain. I've become full Texan, and I can prove it. In California, we have roads that are 2 lanes and then sometimes merge into 1 and then, move back out into 2 again. And the California way of merging from 2 lanes into 1 is for you to believe that your Toyota Camry is part Jeep, because at the end of that merge, you stay nose in front of the other car for as long as you can, like wheels up on the boundary of the freeway, because you do not concede an inch to any other driver on the road. Now, I live in North Cedar Park, and I travel south on Anderson Mill every day of my life, and Anderson Mill in a portion goes from 2 lanes to 1. And I learned something about Texans. I felt terrible the first day I did this. Terrible. I just kept going in my lane, watching people who had stopped in the left lane. Apparently, we believe in civility in Texas, and this is new to me. And so I just did what a Californian would do, and I drove to the end of my lane, and then I got over. And as I'm driving down, I'm like feeling like, oh, I have made a huge mistake. I got in my lane, and I learned. That was it. The next morning, I learned, and when we all started to zipper into the 1 lane that remains, I got over. I was so proud. I'm like, oh, I bet you I can magically smoke brisket now. And then, I'm telling you, the first day that I did the right thing, a car blew past me. And when I tell you the hate in my heart for that driver, how dare they? The frustration in that moment lived here. I learned the right thing to do, And now every morning of my life, my poor sweet daughter has to watch her pastor daddy do the right thing and not turn I'm sure they're all Californians, every person driving past me on that road to not turn them into an enemy. In particular, in the calling that Jesus has for us in the culture we live in, where we always feel like everyone's taking advantage of us at every turn, how can we be obedient to this calling? So let's notice a couple things in the passage, and then let's notice a couple things about our hearts. Jesus says this, do not resist. Turn to him the other cheek. Let him have. Go with him 2 miles. Give, do not refuse to the one. Jesus is pushing on a very specific person in this passage. In each of these 4 examples he gives, someone has been aggressive. And Jesus doesn't challenge the aggressor, does he? He challenges the one who has been aggressed. He challenges the one who's been offended. He challenges me in a power struggle to remind myself to not choose power in a power struggle. That's really frustrating because I'm reading this and I'm like, yeah, Jesus is like, go after the guy who just cut off all these people in this lane. Go after the one who struck the cheek. Go after the one who's taken me court. Go get him, God. From your throne on high, use your power, wisdom, and justice to defend me. And Jesus introduces a concept that's very challenging in this passage. He goes after us. Now, he addresses this core problem. He addresses the problem that fair has a limit. The antithesis this weekend is, you've heard it said, but I say to you, really interesting one. He said, you've heard it said to you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That is from the Mosaic Law. And this is a source of pride. It is a source of honor. It is a source of control and order in a world that was chaotic. The Mosaic Law put boundaries all around conflict. And those boundaries were tremendously fair. It was fair in this, that I was protected from you even if you were more wealthy than me, because with all of your wealth and all of your resources, you couldn't manipulate the system to come after me, because if you had wronged me, you needed to be aware whatever I wind up taking from Tim, I could lose myself. If you were stronger than me, it didn't matter. I'm protected from you, because if you attacked me, whatever you break in me could be broken in you. So if you struck me in a fight and I lost my eye, we know what happens to you. You lose an eye. It doesn't make right in this situation. It's very fair. Now, it also protects you from me. Let's say that your family's in a bad way, okay? You are Jean Valjean from Les Miserables, and you're starving and you're hungry, and you steal one of my goats. I can't ruin your life in revenge. I can't fly off the handle and decide that my revenge allows me to dictate how I respond to you. I'm actually governed in my response. 1899, the Hague Conventions. 1949, the Geneva Conventions. The way that nations address each other is literally based on the old concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We've got fancier language for it now. We talk about a symmetrical or an asymmetrical response in war. But really, we've decided that this is a fantastic way to treat the world fairly. So it's not just that I'm protected from you, because if you attack me, you're actually exposing yourself to the potential for loss, the potential for hurt. You're protected from me. I can't fly off the handle. I can't pull over in traffic and stop that car and let everyone go by that you cut off. And then to teach you a lesson, just keep letting other people drive by because I've got hate in my heart for you. The Mosaic Law governs my response back to you. The third thing that the Mosaic Law does, protects me from you, you from me, it puts control over a broken system. There's this element of we don't have to wonder what's going on. We know what's going on. There's a system in place. God was good when he gave us the Mosaic Law, but it has a limit, because the best the Mosaic Law can be is fair. The best that it can do is govern conflict. And conflict has a weakness. And it's not the law that governs the conflict, it's the people in the conflict. So I am learning more and more about local culture. My daughter signed up for the local volleyball team at her high school, and we did a parent orientation, and I learned that in Texas athletics this year, there's a new law in town. It's a 3-strike rule that if your fan base at your high school during a football game goes after the refs file a complaint to the state, and the state gives your school 1 strike. Because you aren't allowed to go after the refs. And if you get a 2nd strike the next week in football, you're now at 2 strikes. And if week 3 in football, Friday Night Lights, Texas Pride, your parents go after the referees a 3rd time, the great state of Texas will no longer provide referees to your school. Not to your sport, to your school. And it's like, oh wow. Do you mean that the volleyball season could get ruined by one out-of-control parent at football games? Could. Do you mean that baseball would have no umpires because of volleyball season? Could. Do you mean, yes, stop, you did the math already, you figured it out. And it's interesting because some people look at that problem from one angle and they think, wow, that's not fair that a parent during one season early in the year could mess up the whole rest of the year. But here's what's funny about that. The law makes sense. The great state of Texas is acting adults to act like adults in front of children. We could just say it that way. But we've all smelt the weakness in that law, don't we? It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. The Mosaic law put limits on how conflict was governed. And Jesus says, there's a limit there. It's like governing conflict is a bus. And buses can take people places. It can move culture around. But what Jesus introduces this weekend is an airplane. And it rises you above that culture, and it introduces new concepts, new abilities, and you can go more places. It's just that when Jesus does that, it feels like he's reducing you rather than elevating you. And he actually does. He says that the solution is to limit yourself for the sake of others. In each of the 4 examples, he's asked you, you limit yourself. You limit your response. You limit your possession. You limit your strength for the sake of others. That's what's going on in the passage. I don't remember my next click. I think I want to click, but let me take a look. We'll do it in a second here. Here are the ways in which Jesus challenges you to limit yourself. Turn your cheek, give up a cloak, take a hike, or give to those who beg. There's a common theme in all of these, okay? And it is, first of all, found right here. It puts you in a different place of strength. If you take his challenge in the passage, what is the 3rd of the series of 4? If someone compels you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. Well, you might think that's a work ethic thing because of the way our culture has taken that phrase. Go the extra mile. It's actually a place of servitude. If you were a 1st century Jew listening to this, you heard what Jesus was really challenging you to do. The Romans were your occupiers. And one of the ways Rome perpetuated the machine that was Rome is there are different things you had to do for the military if the military defeated you. And so let's say that you're at Style Switch Barbecue having lunch, okay? At either one, but the one that's near me is on 1431, AKA Whitestone. Guys, what's the deal with streets in Austin? Okay. You're at barbecue, and we're going to put this in modern context because we don't walk anywhere. We've risen above that. We have cars. And a Roman soldier walks into Style Switch, they grab lunch, and they're like, hey, I'm on assignment actually down south of Austin. Actually, I need to get to Bastrop. And so that's as far as I'm allowed to make you take me, so I need you to take me to Bastrop. And you're up here in North Austin. And you're like, I am not going to Bastrop today. Well, you had to. That was the rule. You had to do that. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go all the way down. And by the time we get there, there's going to be traffic. And traffic in Austin. Bless your sweetheart, guys. I grew up near LA. We ain't got traffic. But you don't want to go. And Jesus says, you know what? You know, it's a really cool way to put yourself in a position of actually autonomy in this situation. Tell that Roman soldier, hey, where do you have to get to? I'm actually got to get to Houston by tonight. Houston? Why don't I just take you to Houston? Oh, what? Oh, Jesus, I wouldn't do that. Why would I do that? Well, do you see that all of a sudden you became an agent of grace? You just retained your autonomy. You just took on a place of dignity in that relationship. And rather than being petty or being less than or being commanded, you actually offered. It's actually a remarkable change of situation. But it's not just that it puts you in a different place of strength. That when you're in these situations of conflict and you remember the high call of Jesus to have your righteousness exceed the best of your day, it really challenges you to say, "Oh, Jesus, I'd rather have power in a situation. I don't want to give away power. I'm looking to consolidate power." What you have to do probably in this scenario of obedience is step right back right next to your Father and say, "Whew, Jesus, I remember your teaching and I'm frustrated by it, but I want to do it. And so I've got to stand right next to you as my provider, right next to you as my protector. And when I'm standing right here, it's not that I'm seeking my own power to defend myself. I'm asking you, God, can you remind me that you're my defender, you're my protector, and that I don't use the term father as a metaphor, but that I really, truly treat you as a father in this culture." You see, when I'm obedient to this, it puts me in a place of power because it puts me right next to God in obedience. And strength and protection is not merely the absence of danger, it's the presence of the will of God. And so when I yield to Jesus in this teaching, I'm stepping right near him in obedience, going, I'd rather not, but in a sea of bad options, I choose you. And when you choose obedience to God himself, you're in a unique place of power. But it does something else as well. It puts the other person into a place out of conflict into resolution. It takes that other person out of conflict and it puts that person into a place of resolution. So let me say it this way. We'll talk about ancient Greece and then we'll talk about this week. The legend goes that the people of Athens, as they went to settle their city and establish it, they were trying to figure out which Greek god would serve as their patron god for their city. And the legend goes that Poseidon made his case. And Poseidon said, "Hey, people of Athens, if you name your city after me, I promise you victory in every battle." And the people of Athens said, "Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Victory in every battle. I like that. You are strong. You are the god of the sea, and I like the fact that you'd give us victory. Athena, what would you possibly offer us that's better than that?" And the way the legend goes, and obviously it's legend because neither Poseidon nor Athena spoke to them, guys. So the way the legend goes is that Athena said back to them, "I promise you won't have to fight any battles." Oh, wow. They were so intrigued by the first promise that they'd win every battle that they kind of got sucked into that line of thinking that in a power struggle, I choose more power. And Jesus introduces this concept. Why don't you just choose peace? Why don't you just choose the fact that blessed are the peacemakers? Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Why don't you just choose that in a fight, why don't you just tell the other person, "Oh, actually, we're not fighting." "Yeah, we are." "Nah, we're actually not." "Yes, we are." "I mean, you maybe are, but you're doing a terrible job at it right now because I'm not fighting." Now, I say these words, and I'll tell you what's pinging in my head. I have raised teenage boys, okay? And in my home, there were a number of occasions when I wasn't in a fight. I wasn't. But all of a sudden, somewhere along the way, a disagreement over a curfew or an amount of money necessary for food after a game, or somewhere along the way, I realized, wait, am I in a fight? Because I had been pulled into conflict with, my incredible, wonderful, if they're ever watching this, you're the best, teenage boys. I'd been pulled into conflict. And Jesus introduces the concept, you don't have to. You're able to limit yourself for the sake of others. That just doesn't match the ethic of the day. The ethic of the day is that when I decide you're toxic, when you've introduced any microaggression into my life, I cancel you. How in the world is cancel culture going to reflect a gracious God? How in the world is cancel culture going to advance the kingdom? Now, I get it that there are people in culture who are toxic. There really are. But for the most part, we've kind of gone soft as a culture, and we can't handle any level of disagreement, any difference of opinion, and it's like, And that's not even on a spiritual level. The exceeding the righteousness of the best among us, Jesus would introduce this concept. Why don't you limit yourself for the sake of others? Why don't you pull them into resolution when they're begging for fighting? Why don't you tell them, nah, we're actually not fighting. I'm here to promote peace. That's the easy part of the passage. The passage goes on to say this, verse 43. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Even Gentiles do the same. You, therefore, must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Oh, you're sorry you came to church today. Let's slow it down and pull it apart. Jesus says here, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. If you thought you were pressured earlier before that when I'm offended, Jesus doesn't challenge the offender, he challenges me, he's now pulled his attention only, exclusively, squarely to you. And he says, you love your enemies. And then he associates it right back to your relationship with your Father, because that's what your dad expects of you. Whew. He goes on and he says, because the Father makes his sun rise on the evil and the good. That's the way God treats everybody. He sends his rain, most of the country, not on Texas, but he sends his rain on the just and the unjust. Jesus looks at this crowd and he says, I'm asking you to act like the kingdom you say you're a part of. I'm asking you to act like the king of the kingdom you say you're a part of. This is not an unrealistic expectation. This is a consistent expectation. That the reason I told you in the beginning of this is that I want your righteousness to exceed that of the Pharisees and the scribes is that your culture is always going to argue about who can be a little bit better than terrible and assume that that's the standard. But if you want to live with a standard, then live by the standard. And the standard is your Father. And your Father has both high standards for how he conducts himself because his character is holy. He also has high standards for how he treats others. And then that's when you drop this phrase, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Ooh. Well, let's talk about this for a minute then. Let's talk about the high calling to be perfect as he is perfect. This is the point of the sermon. This is actual righteousness. This is godly righteousness. And Jesus is good when he pushes us into the concept that, okay, let's have you step into the seat of the Father through all of this, because when you do, there is some things that'll happen in your heart and through your life which are divine. So let's push into what is divine. God's love has no limit. Therefore, this calls me to need the Spirit of God. To step into loving my enemies is going to now call us to need the Spirit of God. I can kind of work on my anger and read books on anger management and possibly not need God. I can work on my marriage and institute date night and set boundaries on how I communicate with others and potentially not need God. But as Jesus is pushing on all of these areas in the Sermon on the Mount, his desire is that if you struggle with these things, give those areas back over to God, because God will develop your affections to reflect his. So this entire sermon is an invitation for you to surrender things back over to him in a way that surrenders your life to him. But loving your enemies, every day of my life, I am coached, I am begged, I am provoked, I'm prodded, I'm directed to identify people in my culture that are stupid. And because they're stupid, they're ruining America, and because they're ruining in America, you hate them. And so this calling is going to call us to need him in the middle of it. And let me share with you a moment in my adult, while I was a pastor life, where I did not need God, and God challenged me on it. One of the churches I was at for a long, long time decided they were going to invest in the country of Malawi. We had taken an offering as a church, and we decided we wanted to give as many villages as we could clean water forever. Instead of a well, we would go there and we would dig a borehole for perpetual clean water. And it was very encouraging to us as a church. The whole project was a huge win. It was like overjoyed. And my wife went with the team one year, and she came back and she's like, "Tim, you got to go. It's amazing." And I'm like, "All right, I'll go." And the year I went, I took our 8th grade son with us, okay? And I'm just excited. Like, everything about this sounds good, right? Clean water in villages. We were going to stay at a Bible college in Africa and invest in the Bible college. And when we got to the Bible college, they laid out the 10 days of ministry for us. And on day 5, they said, "Hey, one of the things we believe here in Malawian culture is that the gospel should call us to love people who are not like us. As a matter of fact, we believe the gospel calls us to love our enemies. So as a Bible college, we've invested in Maula prison." And I'm like, "Maula campus? Or what'd you say?" And they're like, "Maula prison." And I'm like, "Your word for prison, like it's just in America, a prison is where people go to jail." And they're like, "Yeah, it's the same thing in Africa, Tim. What are you talking about?" I'm like, I was told we'd be serving at a Bible college and we were doing clean water and like click pictures. And I brought my 13-year-old boy with me. I'm actually fine to go into the deep, dark jungles of anywhere. I mean, I've been followed by police through Muslim countries, making sure I wasn't sharing the gospel. Truly and honestly, I'm fine to be in all sorts of situations where God challenges me. But my 8th grade son, Maula prison was built for 800, but it had swollen. It had tripled in its population, and it was overcrowded to the point of like desperation. And I'm really starting to struggle in my walk with God that he had brought me to a situation where he was going to call my son into a situation that I wasn't so sure I wanted my son to have to step into. And so we walked into Maula prison through the gates, and boy, let me tell you, my eyes were wide open that day. And we spent some time serving the men of the prison. We'd provided some food. We'd provided some sanitation support through soaps and clean water. And then they said, "Hey, at the end of serving them for the next couple hours, we'd like you guys to share your testimony with some of the guys. We're going to invite them into a chapel service, and you guys are going to share your testimony." Guys, do you know how many services I've helped put together in the last 25, 30 years of Christian ministry? And if I was putting together a chapel service for African prisoners, I wouldn't think, you know what I'd do? Let's take a middle-class white guy from America and have him share, the tough streets of Austin, Texas. Like, man, them streets out here are mean. Sometimes we have to fold in together in traffic. And I'm just frustrated about all these things that are happening, what God's doing. And my son is going to be in this room with these men sharing the gospel. And I'm like, "God, this is too far. And we just have to do it. I'm not the boss of nothing here." And we sit up front. I shared my testimony. Micaiah Samuel Cool shares his 13-year-old testimony of growing up in the rough home of a pastor. Eric Camarena and Steve Wilmert, we shared our testimony. And I'm like, "Lord, I don't know how you're going to use this." And honestly, guys, I was frustrated. And then the translator got up and challenged the men. He's like, "They've shared their stories of freedom. Do you believe in freedom as well?" 64 men stood up to trust the Lord. And I'm like, I feel so dumb. And we walked outside and he said, "How many of you want to be baptized to demonstrate to the rest of the prison that you've made this decision?" 64 men decided they wanted to be baptized in the prison. And I'm watching all of this feeling so small, so unfull of faith. And I see out of the corner of my eye, my 13-year-old son beaming as he's watching this man get baptized. And I'm like, "Oh, Lord, you reminded me again, when you call me to these areas of challenge that are beyond my ability on my own, God, I need you. God, I need you to remind me of what you've done in my son. Oh, Lord, you own more of my heart. And so as I struggled and wrestled with all of that obedience in that situation, God says, Tim, guess what? I now own more of your heart for an affection for the gospel. 2 years later, my next son was also in 8th grade. I'm like, oh, Judy, you're going to be so excited. I'm taking you to prison. Because in this environment, when God had a higher calling on my life that I wanted to answer on my own, God wound up owning more of my heart than he owned walking into that, right? It's okay when your spiritual walk requires you to need the Spirit of God. It just is. And the call to love your enemy, ooh, it needs that. The second thing it does, though, is this call to love enemy. This takes Jesus everywhere I am. Do you understand that the calling to love your enemy is not just like the example of God sending sun and rain on the just and the unjust? The call for you to love your enemy is the gospel story lived through you. Eric Creekmore did a great job this week reminding us as we prayed and prepped over this message, as Jesus is speaking these words in Matthew chapter 5, do you remember what would happen to Jesus at the end of the book of Matthew? How he would be struck on the cheek, how he'd have his robe stripped from him, how he'd be accused falsely in court. As Jesus is teaching these ideas in the beginning of the gospel, at the end of the gospel, he's living it. And Christian, brother or sister, this is your gospel as well. Romans chapter 5, verses 10 and 11 say this, "For if we were still enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. Oh, much more now that we're reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. More than that, we rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation." We rejoice in this truth because our church is called to the center of the gospel in this practice. I know some enemies I feel like I've got out there in culture. I know some people that I don't necessarily, like Jonah, want God's love to extend to. But I know what the calling of the passage is. The calling of the passage is to have my righteousness exceed the best of my day, and for me to act like my Father in heaven, for my spiritual walk to need the Spirit of God, and to compel me to return back to the heart of what the gospel is in my life, that while I was an enemy, God reconciled me to himself. And so last week I mentioned one of the things that encourages me in my walk, one of the things that encourages me in culture, is that this entire Sermon on the Mount is moving believers in our church to represent him well to tens of thousands. An example I used last week, maybe too quickly, is that our church reaches a lot more than we gather on a weekend. And people have asked me, Tim, is it intimidating to speak to such a large church? No, this is the huddle. Our church speaks to many all week long. Because as soon as you leave here, you probably will interact with 10 people this week, right? And you're like, well, I'm going to interact with 10 people I like. I'm going to interact with a lot more that I don't like. Cool, excellent. So our church this week has the potential to reach 50,000. Does that make sense? Because as we interact on a Monday and a Tuesday and a Wednesday, as we're at soccer practice or at work or in the grocery store, and you see these people, it's almost like Jesus is challenging you. I'm allowed to go everywhere you go. And if you draw lines around people where like, I'm not taking Jesus there, you've already decided where Jesus can't go. But his affection already rests on them in the same way it rested on you while you were still an enemy. And so Hill Country Bible Church, I know that the world has lost its ever-loving mind. I know. It's just that Jesus is restoring the world to himself through you. And so Hill Country, I'm pumped that God has given us collectively an audience of 50,000 people to communicate to this week. And as you move about your life, can you pray on this? Jesus, could you call me to have an affection for my enemies? And for some of you, you're going to need to do some soul work this week just in your walk with him about that. I get it. That's okay. But for some of you, you've got a lot of Lord, I've got a lot of trust built with you on this. You're right, though, Jesus. I've decided you're not allowed to go to these places because I don't want to go to those places. Can you pray that Jesus would use you in those environments? And in that way, y'all, we're just going to keep changing the world. Let's pray. Jesus, I feel the weight, Lord, of the calling of your words on my life before I speak about it on a stage. And Lord, I am aware of my own shortcomings. I'm aware of my own heart battles with you on these things for obedience. So Lord, I pray that you would call my life to be an example before I have words to describe it. And Lord, I pray that same thing for my church. I pray that you would be calling each of us to have a deep affection for obedience to you in this. Lord, that obedience would call us to actually need your Spirit in our lives. And then, Lord, the result of that, I pray that your Spirit would animate us to brag about your Son. And Lord, in this way, we would continue to be a church that's always going to be about what we've always been about, each of us together, saturating our town with the love of Jesus. We pray that these things would honor him. And everyone said, amen.